Hello there, lovely people. It's Alex from Nintendo Life here, and Sony have just announced that they are going to be releasing their own, and it's such a wonderfully unique and original idea, the PlayStation Mini. I haven't seen anything like that before. As such, we're going to be talking about 5 times that Sony completely and blatantly ripped off Nintendo in an act of heinous crime. I'm sorry, I just get genuinely really upset whenever I think about all the hard work that Nintendo's put in, and Sony just comes in and just steals it. Okay, real talk. Copying goes on in any industry. We're not genuinely upset about it. It's something that just happens, and you know, you just gotta accept it and move on. So don't take this list too seriously, it's just a bit of fun. We're still gonna get comments saying we're fanboys though, aren't we? But anyway, that is more than enough waffling to say the least. Let's dive right into things. At number 5, we have the PlayStation Controller, because yes, this may look fairly unique and it just looks like one of the later PlayStation controllers. How on earth are you possibly gonna spin this one, Alex? Well, I mean, if you think of the original PlayStation controller, and I mean this one, the original, not the Dualshock, you chop its legs off and you remove some of the shoulder buttons, and what have you got? I'll tell you, you got a SNES controller. It's not something that I noticed until it was actually pointed out to me, but yeah, it basically is just an enhanced SNES controller with some comfy extra long bits to properly grip onto, which is a genuine improvement, some extra shoulder buttons, and that's about it. I've never actually used the original PlayStation controller personally. I went straight on with the Dualshocks, and even then it wasn't very often because I've never properly owned a Sony system. I do have a PS2 in the house, but it's not plugged in, and I'm still not sure if it works. One thing they couldn't copy though was the D-pad, because Nintendo had a patent on that, and I believe the patent ran out only a few years ago with the Xbox One and the PS4, which is why all of a sudden those standard, you know, these lovely standard cross-shaped D-pads are appearing everywhere, because Nintendo no longer has the patent for it. It expired. But the PlayStation D-pad, I've always hated it, and I'm so pleased it's dead. At number 4, I've kind of already briefly mentioned it, yes, the analog sticks on the Dualshock. Now, you may argue that Sony got it right, and realistically, their analog sticks are much closer to what we have today than what came before and what they were copying, which was the N64 controller. Whilst Sega did originally come out with the first sort of console analog stick in the sense that we know it, it was sort of rushed out, it didn't really work very well, and that was only after Nintendo had announced the Ultra 64, as it was at the time, the N64, with its analog controller, and Sega were just like, we better do something quick. In fact, actually, the very first analog control on a console as the standard interface was the Audiosonics 1292 Advanced Programmable Video System, released back in 1976. I'm guessing that just means analog in the sense of an analog signal, rather than an analog stick. But Nintendo mainstreamed it. They took the idea and they ran with it. And of course they hedged their bets because they just kept a D-pad on there as well. That's why it's got 3 prongs, so that you can hold it either in, you know, analog stick mode, or if analog didn't take off, they could just say, oh, okay, and just go back to the D-pad, and everyone would have been happy. And then Sony just dives in and they say, we'll have one of them too, only we'll do it in a probably better way and stick another one on, which will become the standard for gaming for pretty much ever. The heartless bastards! At number 3, it's the PlayStation Move. It's basically a Wii remote, but not quite as good. Yeah, at the time everybody was trying to latch onto the whole motion control craze, because everyone saw the Wii and saw the massive market it had, and the massively increased the size of the market, rather than just taking a sort of a larger share, and everyone was like, we'd like some of that market, and Sony was no different. The PlayStation Move controller is probably the most obvious instance of a blatant copycat trying to muscle in on exactly the same territory as the Wii that the Wii remote sort of grabbed. It's a sort of remote that's held in one hand with motion controls, and you sort of wave it around like that. It's a Wii remote, but for the PlayStation. Isn't it? They did have a couple of interesting ideas with things like the glowing ball on the end to track, and that was actually relatively effective from what I understand, but overall it was a bit sort of, bit clunky, and it didn't sort of realize its potential in the same way as the Wii. It's sort of a bit like the Game Gear Game Boy argument. I can't believe I forgot the name of that. The Wii Remote was arguably a little bit more primitive, and the PlayStation Move was a more advanced, arguably more refined version of basically the same thing, but the cheaper, more just accessible version that maybe isn't quite as good, but people can just pick up and go, ha 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 ha, this is most enjoyable. One. Also, it didn't help that it was an optional accessory and not something that was bundled with the console, like the Wii Remote. If you wanted to use the Wii, you had to use a Wii Remote at least at some point, which you didn't have that with the PlayStation Move, so it wasn't sort of forced into people's hands in the same way. At number 2, we've got the Totaku Collection, which... it certainly isn't Amiibo, we promise. Yeah, this one isn't anywhere near as concrete per se, and you could argue that Nintendo were copying things like Skylanders with Amiibo, but that would make the list more complicated, and we don't like complicated. We like simple. That's why they've got me doing this. Amiibo were a massive hit when they first came out, and they're still popular today, but Sony saw that and they thought, we don't have to do a Skylanders or a Disney Infinity or anything like that. We can also just, sort of produce a range of figures from all sorts of different franchises and sell them off, but they don't have any functions like Amiibo do. I think really that was the killer app for Amiibo, and it was not new. Same thing with Skylanders and stuff like that, but it had this sort of general purpose. It had a function as well as being a nice little thing to look at, and very nice indeed. Whilst the Totaku Collection, it's just some models, which are nice enough, but it's just some models. There's a fruit fly in here. And it was a bit of a mixed bag, to say the least. I mean, Amiibo on the whole are characters, I'd say a good 98% of Amiibo are just characters. They are characters from games, some of them important, some of them not. And Sony did the same thing, they had Crash Bandicoot, they had the Sackboy from Little Big Planet, and then they also had stuff like the car from Wipeout. But I don't know, these didn't seem to really take off in the same way. I mean, you could argue the NFC capabilities really gave Amiibo some... Got it! Really gave Amiibo some weight in terms of saleability, but even so, these models are still really, really nice to look at. They're really well-made models. But I suppose maybe they're just models. And finally, at number 1, we have got... I need to refer to my notes. PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. This is essentially a Sony version of Super Smash Bros, and it is such a rip-off, it's not even funny. Okay, it is. Nintendo has this enormous library of amazingly recognizable characters. You look at Mario, you look at Link, you look at... To be honest, even any of their minor characters, you look at them and you sort of think, oh yeah, that's fun and colourful and recognizable and, memorable, and it's very Nintendo, for lack of a better term. Sony indeed does have access to some characters like this as well, but Sony don't sort of actively own many properties. It's mainly third parties, or I suppose second parties, if that's still a thing. I mean, they had the characters you'd expect, like Sackboy and Crash Bandicoot and Parappa the Rapper, if you expected that. But then they also had Kratos and Uncharted's Nathan Drake, a Big Daddy from Bioshock. It's not as inspiring as seeing Mario kill Ganondorf. And what's more, the game isn't an awful lot of fun either. It's just sort of a shadow of the idea. The idea is very similar to Smash Bros, and I'm sure with maybe a little bit longer in the oven or a little bit more backing behind it, it could have been just as good. If you take the whole sort of character and recognizability out of it. I mean, just purely mechanically, it could have been as good, but it just wasn't. It wasn't as mechanically fun or sound or refined, and the cast sort of started with the ones that you knew and trailed off into the who. It's just not as good as Smash, it's just a pale imitation, and it doesn't hold up even today. And there you have it, 5 times that Sony copied Nintendo, but before we go, let's balance things out a little bit and have a look at times that Nintendo has copied Sony, because it goes both ways. Whilst it was actually SNK that started the whole thing, the idea of a memory card was really popularized by PlayStation and Sony, and Nintendo did ignore that with the N64, mostly, and then they did release a sort of a memory card that you put in the back of the controller. But yeah, when it came to the GameCube, Nintendo were just like, yep, we're doing memory cards as well. There's the idea of using 2 analog sticks instead of 1, as we previously mentioned. When it came to the GameCube yet again, Nintendo were like, That's not a bad idea. And of course, paid online. Yep, Nintendo Switch Online is just basic, it's PSN, which is also kind of copying Xbox Live, but let's not go down that rabbit hole. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, then why don't you copy everything that subscribe button's doing, which is being an integral part of Nintendo life and following every video vigorously. And be sure to check out nintendolife.com for all sorts of lovely Nintendo-related content. Thank you again for watching. Bye-bye.